Welcome to Tabitha Revenge Stories, where every twist keeps you on the edge of your seat. If you love thrilling revenge tales, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, so you never miss a new story. I stood in the hallway watching my father say the words that would change everything. His voice was calm, not angry. That made it worse somehow. Anger would have felt like passion. This felt like a final decision made long ago. "This house is not for people who fail us," he said, looking at me like I was a stranger. My mother wouldn't look at me at all. She just stared at the wall like I'd already disappeared. "Leave," my father said. "And don't come back." It wasn't a moment of rage. It was a moment of absolute certainty. Like they'd discussed this. Like they'd decided who I was and what I deserved. And they'd decided I deserved nothing. I walked out of that house carrying a single bag with whatever fit inside. Relatives were there. They watched me leave. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said anything. Nobody tried to convince my parents to change their minds. They just watched me go like I was someone they'd never known. I closed the door behind me and stood in the driveway for a moment, waiting for someone to come after me. Waiting for someone to say they'd made a mistake. Nobody came. I spent that first night in a cheap motel room, shaking. Not from cold. From the shock of it. From the finality of it. My phone showed missed calls. From my mother. From my father. From relatives asking where I was. I didn't answer any of them. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark, trying to understand what had just happened. The next day, I made a decision. Instead of calling them back. Instead of begging to come home. Instead of trying to fix whatever I'd supposedly broken. I deleted the contacts. All of them. My parents. My siblings. All of it. If they didn't want me, then I wouldn't want them. That was the story I told myself anyway. That was the narrative that helped me move forward. What my family didn't know was that I'd already started something small. Freelance work. Just a side project that wasn't quite stable enough to live on yet. But it was something. I'd been building this quietly while living at home, thinking maybe one day it would matter. Thinking maybe one day I'd have an escape route. Turns out I needed it sooner than I expected. I took every job available. Multiple freelance projects. Gig work. Anything that would pay rent on the cheapest apartment I could find. Nobody from my family knew. They thought I was failing. They assumed I'd come crawling back within weeks. They believed I couldn't survive without them. But I was surviving. Barely, but I was surviving. Eventually, the work stabilized. The freelance projects became more consistent. The income became more reliable. I could afford a slightly better apartment. I could eat more than ramen. I was still living barely above poverty line, but I wasn't desperate anymore. I wasn't begging for scraps. Meanwhile, my parents were telling everyone that I'd chosen to leave. That it was my decision. That they'd never kicked me out. The story was being rewritten without me. They were positioning themselves as the victims of my choice rather than the authors of my exile. I heard through an old friend that my family was calling me ungrateful. That they were saying I was selfish. That they were telling people I'd abandoned them. I realized the silence was being weaponized against me. My absence was being interpreted as proof of my failures. My refusal to come back was being twisted into evidence of my ingratitude. But I didn't respond. I just kept working. A major opportunity came through. A client wanted me to work on a larger project. It would require relocating to a different city. Better pay. Better opportunities. A real career path. I took it immediately. I left the city without telling my family where I was going. No forwarding address. No explanation. Nothing that would allow them to find me if they tried. I was going to build a life they couldn't reach. A life completely separate from theirs. In the new city, I rebuilt my identity professionally. I created a name for myself. I established a reputation. I wasn't the failed daughter anymore. I was someone new. Someone successful. People didn't know my family. They didn't know my history. They only knew what I presented, a competent, professional woman who did good work. My first major success came faster than I expected. A significant client. A high-profile project. My name started getting recognition in my field. I was becoming known for what I could do. Not known for my failures. The financial independence came gradually, then suddenly. One day I realized I had savings. Real savings. Not scraping by money. I had a career. Not just jobs. I had a future that wasn't dependent on anyone else's support or approval. Years passed. I was established now. Successful in ways I'd never imagined when I was sleeping in that cheap motel room. My parents must have realized I wasn't failing. They must have noticed that I wasn't coming back. The certainty they'd had when they expelled me was probably starting to crack. I found out they'd been trying to locate me. Old family friends. Relatives with connections. They were looking. But I'd been careful. I'd built a life that didn't connect back to who I'd been before. I learned something that surprised me. They were following my career from a distance. They knew about my success. They knew I was doing well. They just didn't know how well. They thought I was still struggling. That I'd finally found minor success after years of failure. They didn't understand that I'd become someone significant in my field. I saw how distorted their version of my life was. They were proud of me for finally making it, not realizing I'd already been there for years. They didn't know who I'd become because they'd never bothered to look closely. They had no idea that the life I'd built was better than anything they could have offered me. A message came through an indirect channel. A family friend relaying what my parents wanted to say. They wanted me to come home. They wanted to reconcile. They wanted me to come back. I ignored it. Instead of responding to their request, I focused on my work. I took on bigger projects. I expanded my business. I grew my influence and reach. I didn't need them anymore. I'd never need them again. My success became undeniable. Public. Visible to anyone who looked. Articles about my work. Recognition in my industry. Awards. Speaking engagements. Someone from my family finally saw it. They realized it wasn't a minor recovery. This was significant success. My parents understood, finally, that I wasn't coming back because I didn't need to. That I wasn't struggling. That I had built something real without them. Their narrative collapsed. The story they'd been telling themselves about who I was and what I was capable of was completely wrong. I agreed to meet them. but on my terms. At a location of my choice. At a time that worked for me. When we sat down together, they barely recognized me. Not physically, but professionally. Personally. They didn't know this person I'd become. I was no longer their daughter who'd failed them. I was someone they'd never known. I calmly presented what I'd built. The business. The recognition. The independence. The life I'd created entirely on my own. They tried to take credit. They tried to say I must have gotten help from someone. They tried to regain the narrative. But the evidence was there. The years of work. The timeline. The reality that I had done this without them. They tried to manipulate me emotionally. They cried. They apologized. They asked me to come home. But I was no longer the person who wanted to come home. I was no longer the person who needed their approval. I was no longer the person who would accept their conditions or their control. I stood up from that meeting with absolute clarity. No anger. No tears. Just a complete understanding that they could no longer reach me. I left without promises. Without apologies. Without giving them anything they could use to pull me back in. I had left when they told me to leave. And I had built a life they could no longer reach. They said I was a failure. They said this house wasn't for people like me. They said I should leave and never come back. So I did. And in the years that followed, I became someone they never expected. Someone successful. Someone independent. Someone who didn't need them. The cruelest part wasn't the expulsion. The cruelest part was that they watched me leave and never believed I could survive without them. And when I did survive, when I thrived, it broke them. Not because they missed me, but because it proved them wrong. I didn't come back angry. I didn't come back victorious. I came back healed. And I left again, completely at peace. The life I built was better than anything they could have given me. And that was the final victory. If this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I would love to see you in the next one.